The morning Eleanor spent correcting the household correspondence was, by any measure, an ordinary one. The fire in the library had been laid, but not yet lit. Her breath was just visible in the cold air of the room, and the smell of old paper and faint wood smoke settled around her, the way it always did in the early hours of an autumn morning in Wiltshire, before anyone else in Marsh House was stirring. She had pulled her wool shawl tighter and sat down at the writing desk her father had used, dipped his pen, and begun the day's work. She had been doing this for 3 years. Since her father's death in the spring of 1828, the library had become, quietly and without ceremony, her province. Lady Cecilia Marsh had no use for books, and made no pretence otherwise. The household accounts, the tenant correspondence, the letters from her father's former solicitor in Bath, the replies to social invitations that Lady Cecilia received and could not quite be troubled to answer herself, all of it moved through Eleanor's hands. No one had asked her to take it on. It had simply accumulated around her, the way useful women accumulate work in households where usefulness is confused with invisibility. The library itself was worth preserving. Eleanor's father, the late Mr. William Marsh, had spent 30 years building the collection. Latin texts acquired from a bookseller in Edinburgh, a long shelf of philosophical correspondence bound in red leather, a complete set of Gibbon, beside a run of Johnson, botanical surveys of Wiltshire and Dorset in their original folios. He had taught Eleanor to read Latin at the age of 11, and the declension tables he had written out for her in his neat, unhurried hand were still folded inside the front cover of her Virgil. She had memorized them long since, but she kept the paper there because it had his handwriting on it, and some things you do not remove. On the morning the stranger first appeared at the gate, Eleanor was rereading a passage in Cicero's letters that she had been thinking about for a week. It concerned the proper relationship between private obligation and public conduct, and she had found herself returning to it the way one returns to a piece of music that has not yet resolved itself. She did not hear the bell. She heard Mrs. Holt's footsteps in the corridor, and then Mrs. Holt's careful knock. Mrs. Holt had been the housekeeper at Marsh House since before Eleanor was born. She was a compact woman of middle years, with grey beginning at her temples and an expression that conveyed competence and very little else, unless you knew her well enough to read the small adjustments at the corners of her mouth. Eleanor knew her well enough. She set down her pen. "A gentleman at the gate, Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Holt said. "He is asking whether the library might be made available to him for some days of study. He carries letters of introduction, and he has been very civil." Eleanor looked up. It was not an unusual request in the county. Her father had extended the use of his collection to several neighbouring scholars over the years, and the reputation of the library had, apparently, survived him. "Has my mother been informed?" "Lady Cecilia is aware," Mrs. Holt said, and something in the precision of that phrasing told Eleanor that Lady Cecilia had given permission less out of generosity than out of a desire not to be inconvenienced by the decision herself. "She asks only that you see to his requirements so that the matter does not disturb her mourning." This was Lady Cecilia's customary arrangement for anything that involved the library. Eleanor set down the Cicero, straightened the correspondence she had been sorting, and went to receive the gentleman at the front of the house. He was standing in the entrance hall when she descended, hat in hand, in a coat of good wool that had nonetheless seen a great deal of weather. He was perhaps 35, with the kind of stillness about him that some men carry as a natural condition, and others learn from some long practice of discipline. His hands, Eleanor noticed, were very clean and very still, and he held the hat with a precision that seemed at odds with the studied plainness of the rest of his presentation. He had brown hair, darker at the temples, and eyes of a grey-green that looked at her steadily without any of the appraisal she had learned to expect from men who were introduced to the household, and immediately began calculating the value of what they found there. He inclined his head. "Miss Marsh, I am grateful for the house's indulgence. I am Jonathan Dawson, lately of Edinburgh, and I have a particular interest in several of the Latin texts your father's collection is known to contain. I shall not disturb the household." His voice was level, unhurried, and did not quite match the coat. "You will not disturb it," Eleanor said, because she had already decided he would not. "I have the catalogue prepared, if you will follow me." She showed him the relevant shelves herself, because Mrs. Holt had returned to the kitchen, and because it would have taken longer to explain the organization of the collection to anyone else than to simply walk him through it. The Latin texts occupied 2 long shelves on the east wall, arranged by the date of Eleanor's father's acquisition rather than by any bibliographic logic. Jonathan Dawson moved along the shelves without touching anything, reading the spines with the quiet attention of a man who was looking for something specific and was not yet ready to announce what it was. He asked her one question. He asked whether the Tacitus was the Brotier edition or an earlier printing. She told him it was the Brotier, acquired in 1809, and that there was a marginal annotation in what she believed was her father's hand that corrected a misreading in Book 4. He looked at her then, not with surprise exactly, but with the quality of attention that sharpens when a conversation has just become more interesting. He returned the next morning, and the one after. The pattern established itself without being negotiated. He came after 10 o'clock, when the household correspondence was finished, and Lady Cecilia had descended to the morning room. He worked at the smaller desk near the east window, the one that received the best light in the autumn hours, and Eleanor worked at her father's desk in the centre of the room. They did not speak for long stretches. When they did speak, it was about the texts. He had a precise habit of thought and expressed himself in sentences that arrived without preamble and closed without trailing, and Eleanor found this restful in a way she had not anticipated. Most conversations she was expected to have at Marsh House involved a great deal of preamble and very little that was worth the listening. On the 4th morning, he left his transcription open on the desk while he went to retrieve a second volume from the shelf. Eleanor's eye moved across it with the unconscious habit of someone who has spent years reading other people's correspondence, and she caught what looked, for a moment, like a case error. 3rd declension, genitive singular, the kind of mistake a careful scholar would not make, but that was easy enough to miss in the rendering. She had taken up a small card and written the correction in pencil before she had quite decided to do it. He returned with the second volume, looked at the card, and said nothing for a moment. "I believe I may have misread the original," Eleanor said, not quite looking at him, because it had occurred to her a second too late that correcting a scholar's work without invitation was not, strictly speaking, what a hostess was expected to do. "Please disregard it if I am wrong." "You're not wrong," he said. He placed the card beside the transcription and looked at it for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you." He set the second volume down, found his place, and continued working. Eleanor picked up her Cicero and did not read a single sentence for the next quarter hour. This, she would learn later, was precisely what he had intended. The error in the transcription had been deliberate, placed with the careful aim of a man who wanted to know something specific about her. Not whether she knew Latin, which a glance at the books around her could have told him, but whether she would extend a plain correction to someone she perceived as socially below her standing without cruelty and without performance. Whether she would do it as an act of ordinary regard, the way a person who treats all knowledge as worthy of accuracy might do it, not to make him feel small, but simply because the text mattered and the correction was there to be made. She had done it in pencil. He had noticed that too, but none of this surfaced until much later, and in the days that followed the penciled card, Eleanor knew only that their conversations had shifted in temperature without anything being said about it. He began to bring his own questions to her rather than reserving them for the texts. He asked her opinion of Brotier's editorial judgments. He asked whether she thought Tacitus was reliable on the character of Tiberius, or whether the moralism of the historian had contaminated the history. She answered as she would have answered her father, which was to say directly, and without first considering whether the opinion was an appropriate one for a woman in her position to hold. He listened without interrupting. He disagreed twice, with the measured precision of someone whose disagreement is a form of respect rather than a form of correction. November arrived with its characteristic rudeness, pressing cold against the library's east windows and turning the light from gold to grey by 3:30. The fire was always lit by the time Jonathan arrived now, because Eleanor had begun lighting it herself rather than waiting for the housemaid to do it, which was not a habit she examined too closely. He noticed one morning that the grate had been recently cleared and the kindling laid with more care than usual, and he said only, "The fire is well this morning," in the tone of a man noting a fact, and Eleanor said, "It is," and they both returned to their books, and the morning moved forward in the warmth of it. He had been coming to the library for 3 weeks when Lady Cecilia informed Eleanor that she was to be married. The announcement was made at dinner, in the way Lady Cecilia made announcements that she expected to be received rather than discussed. Flatly, as though reading from a list, with Finch's name and situation presented as 2 positive entries in a social ledger. Mr. Alistair Finch was a man of some property in the next county, with connections to a family that had been useful to the Marshes in a matter of social credit that Lady Cecilia described only as an obligation settled appropriately. He was 41 years old. He had called at Marsh House twice, on both occasions speaking primarily to Lady Cecilia, while Eleanor sat at the corner of the table with the sensation of furniture being appraised. "He is not a brilliant match," Lady Cecilia said in the tone she used when she was preemptively dismissing objections she had not yet been given. "But he is a steady one, and steadiness is what this household requires. You will not be unreasonable about this, Eleanor." Eleanor said, "I understand," because it was the only answer that did not require a further conversation, and because she had learned, in the 3 years since her father's death, that certain conversations with her mother did not end. They only temporarily paused. Alistair Finch came to Marsh House 4 days later, in a carriage that was very clean and a coat that was very new, and he walked through the rooms of the house with the proprietary ease of a man who has been told that a transaction is essentially complete. He showed no particular interest in Eleanor as a person. He showed considerable interest in the drawing room's proportions and the view from the south windows, and when he stood in the doorway of the library, he glanced at the shelves and remarked that there were rather a lot of books. "There are," Eleanor agreed. "I suppose they have their uses," he said, and moved on to inspect the morning room. Jonathan was not in the library that day. Eleanor spent the afternoon in the library alone, under the pretext of cataloguing a section of the natural history folios, and she did not catalogue anything at all. She sat at her father's desk with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the Cicero where she had left it and thought about the word manageable and what it meant and who had been using it. She found out 2 days later, and she did not mean to find out at all. She had come down to the library early before the fire was lit because she had not been able to sleep, and she wanted the room for its own sake. She had not yet reached the library door when she heard her mother's voice from inside the morning room, which shared a wall with the east corridor, and which had a habit of projecting sound into the corridor when the door was ajar, as it was now. "She is bookish," Lady Cecilia was saying. "I will not pretend otherwise. But she is entirely biddable when the circumstances are correctly managed. You need not concern yourself with the library or any of that. It is a hobby, nothing more. She will be managed." There was a pause, and then Mr. Finch's voice lower, with a satisfied quality that Eleanor recognized as the sound of a man who has just received an assurance he wanted. "I have no objection to a quiet wife, provided she understands what is expected." "She will understand," Lady Cecilia said. "She has always understood what was expected." Eleanor stood in the cold corridor with one hand against the wainscoting, not because she needed its support, but because she had stopped moving, and her hand had found the wood and stayed there. She was entirely biddable. She would be managed. She had always understood what was expected. 3 years of correspondence answered, accounts kept, fires lit, declining invitations she was not asked about, conducting her entire interior life inside the boundaries of what this house required of her, and her mother's summary of it, offered to a man she had met 4 times, was that she would be managed. She stayed in the corridor until she heard the morning room door shift further open, and then she walked back upstairs before she could be seen. She did not go to the library that morning. She sat in her room at the small writing desk she kept there and looked at the paper in front of her for a long time. She thought about her father, who had read Cicero with her in the evenings and had told her once that the measure of a person was what they chose to do when the only witness was their own conscience. She thought about what she had built in that library over 3 years, what she had tended and catalogued and corresponded over and argued about quietly in conversations that no one in this house had thought to value. She thought about the betrothal register that Lady Cecilia had mentioned at dinner the previous week, the one that would be produced for her signature before the formal banns were filed, as a preliminary agreement, a paper that would make the transaction legible to the law before it was made visible to the church. She thought about the word managed, and she found that she was not devastated. She was, quite precisely, resolved. When Jonathan arrived the next morning, she was already in the library. She had lit the fire and opened the Cicero to the passage about private obligation and public conduct, and she looked up when he entered with the directness she had stopped editing by the 2nd week of his visits. "You are early," he said. "I had something to think about," she said. "The thinking required the room." He set down his coat and took his place at the east window desk, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was entirely natural. But somewhere in the hour that followed, without quite knowing she had decided to, she said, "My mother has arranged a betrothal for me, to Mr. Finch, of whom you may have heard nothing and of whom nothing particular needs to be said." He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression carried none of the social calibrations she might have expected, none of the careful sympathy that people produce when they are deciding how much to involve themselves. He looked at her the way he had looked at the corrected transcription, steadily and without performance. "I see," he said. "I have not yet signed the register," she said. "I have been considering whether I will." "And what does the consideration suggest?" She looked at the Cicero. "That I will not," she said. "That I would rather endure whatever follows that refusal than permit myself to be described the way I have heard myself described." He said nothing. She had not expected him to say anything. What he did was set down his pen, fold his hands on the desk, and look out at the November garden through the east window. And the quality of his stillness in that moment was the quality of a man who has made up his mind about something and is deciding only how to proceed. The betrothal register appeared on a Wednesday morning, placed on the breakfast table by Lady Cecilia, with the serene efficiency of someone who considers a matter already settled. It was a straightforward document. Eleanor's name, Finch's name, the date, and 2 blank lines for signatures, one above the other, with the solicitor's name at the foot. Mr. Finch was in the house. He was waiting in the drawing room with the patient ease of a man who has been told the wait will be brief. Lady Cecilia set the pen beside the register and said, "There is no reason to delay this, Eleanor." Eleanor looked at the paper. She looked at it for the length of time it takes to read something twice and decide. Then she set the pen down on the table, away from the register, and said, "I will not sign it." Lady Cecilia's expression did not change immediately. It processed the way an expression processes when it has encountered something it did not plan for. "Eleanor!" "I will not be managed," Eleanor said. "I heard that word used of me by someone who had no right to use it, and I will not sign a document that gives it legal standing. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." She was not sorry for the inconvenience. She was very clear on that point inside the privacy of her own chest, where her heart was beating with a steadiness that surprised her. Lady Cecilia rose. "You are being entirely unreasonable. Mr. Finch is waiting." "I know he is," Eleanor said. "He may continue to wait, or he may go. Those are his choices. I have told you mine." The ensuing half-hour was one of the more uncomfortable of Eleanor's life, but she had anticipated it, and it proceeded roughly as she had anticipated. Her mother invoked the obligation. Eleanor acknowledged the obligation and said it was not hers to discharge in the manner proposed. Lady Cecilia moved from civic argument to personal exhortation, to a species of theatrical disappointment that she deployed with some skill, and Eleanor sat through all of it at the breakfast table with her hands in her lap, meeting each wave with the same level response until the wave ran out of force. She did not know that Mrs. Holt was in the corridor outside the breakfast room during part of this. She did not know what Mrs. Holt had decided to do before the morning was out. The drawing-room gathering that afternoon had been Lady Cecilia's arrangement, called together hastily under the pretext of Finch's continued presence, and the need to bring a degree of social formality to what had become a domestic impasse. There were 4 people present when Eleanor entered. Lady Cecilia, Mr. Finch, the solicitor's clerk who had brought the register, and Jonathan, who was there because Mrs. Holt had shown him in from the library passage with the calm assurance of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and has decided that the moment requires it. Eleanor looked at him in the doorway. He was standing in the room in a posture she had seen every day for 4 weeks, in the library, and had also never quite seen, because in the library it had been softened by the informality of their shared work. In the drawing-room, without the scholar's coat and without the pretext of the texts on the desk between them, the posture was simply what it was. It was the posture of a man who has been addressed as a form of address all his life and has simply never lost the habit of it. Lady Cecilia turned to look at him with the measuring expression she applied to people she did not recognize. She had not, in 3 weeks, condescended to visit her own library while it was in use. "Mr. Dawson," she said with the precise degree of coolness she applied to persons of scholarly occupation and no social standing. It was Mrs. Holt who answered, stepping forward from the doorway with the kind of quiet clarity that belongs to people who have been holding a truth for a long time and have decided this is the moment to put it down. "My lord," she said, addressing Jonathan with the complete naturalness of long familiarity, "I thought you would wish to be present." The room altered. There is no other word for what happened to it. The temperature, the angle of light through the south windows, the weight of the afternoon. None of it changed, and yet something in the arrangement of the room shifted, as though a piece of furniture had been moved to reveal that the wall behind it was not a wall at all. Lady Cecilia said very precisely, "I beg your pardon." Finch looked at the solicitor's clerk. The clerk looked at no one. Jonathan looked at Eleanor, and his expression was the same expression she had seen when he lifted the penciled card from his transcription, which was to say that it was entirely steady, and that there was something in it that had been waiting to be seen for a considerable number of weeks. "My proper designation," he said, and his voice was the same measured, unhurried voice that had discussed Tacitus and the reliability of moralistic historians for 4 weeks, across the east window desk. "Is Ashford. Jonathan Aldridge, Earl of Ashford. I had reason to keep that information from this room until a better moment, and this appears to be the better moment." What followed was not, strictly speaking, dramatic. It was something quieter and more final than drama. Lady Cecilia stood at the centre of her drawing room in front of a social audience of 4 people, one of whom had turned out to be the holder of one of the older earldoms in Wiltshire, and the social architecture she had spent the morning constructing: the arranged betrothal, the managed daughter, the obligation discharged. All of it simply failed to stand up under the weight of the reality she had been misreading for 3 weeks. Mr. Finch cleared his throat. He said, with the air of a man reconsidering a transaction in the light of new information, that perhaps the matter required further reflection. He retrieved his hat from the side table. He said his goodbyes to the room at large, and not to Eleanor in particular, which was precisely as Eleanor would have predicted. And he departed. The clerk followed him with the unsigned register under his arm. Lady Cecilia looked at Jonathan, and the look was one Eleanor recognized from the Cicero, from the passage about public conduct, the specific expression of a person discovering that the facts of the situation are not what they had organized their behavior around. The expression did not resolve itself into anything graceful. It settled after a moment into something that was not quite contrition and not quite acknowledgement, but was at least the precursor to both. "I was not aware," Lady Cecilia said at last, with the stiffness of someone enunciating carefully, because the alternative is to say something worse. "No," Jonathan said simply. "You were not." He did not offer her comfort or difficulty. He simply confirmed the fact and let the drawing room hold what it held. Eleanor watched her mother navigate the social wreckage of her own certainty, and she felt nothing vindictive about it. She felt, if she was honest, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent 3 years living inside a structure that has now been revealed as unsound, and who does not yet know what they will build in its place, but knows with the absolute certainty of a person who has been let out of a small, dark room that they will have a hand in building it. Later that afternoon, she found Jonathan in the library. He was at the east window desk, his coat across the back of the chair, and he looked up when she entered with the same quality of attention he had given her every morning for 4 weeks. The fire was burning. The Cicero was where she had left it. She sat down at her father's desk and looked at the Latin text, open on the surface, and said, without preamble, because she had earned the right to speak without preamble in this particular room, "You made the error in the transcription deliberately." "I did," he said, "to see what I would do." "To see how you would do it," he said, which was a more precise answer than she had given him credit for. "Whether you would correct it the way you correct an argument as a matter of ordinary care, or whether you would correct it the way some people correct those they consider below them, as a demonstration of standing." "And you used a pencil," he said. "And you said, please disregard it if I am wrong, even though you were not wrong, and you knew you were not wrong. That told me what I needed to know." Eleanor considered this. "You might have introduced yourself properly," she said. "I might have," he agreed. "Had I done so, I would not have learned anything useful. The county knows my name and my title and the acreage of Ashford Park, and all of that information tells me nothing whatsoever about whether a person's decency is conditional. She looked at him for a moment. And is Ashford Park very large? The corner of his mouth moved. It has a library, he said, that I think you would find adequate. There was a pause in which the fire shifted and the afternoon light through the east window moved across the surface of the writing desk, and Eleanor thought about her father's folded declension tables inside the Virgil and what it would mean to carry them somewhere, and whether the carrying was a leaving or a taking. I should like to see it, she said at last. He looked at her in the way that had always meant, in the quiet vocabulary they had built across 4 weeks of shared texts and autumn mornings, that something had been confirmed which did not need to be said aloud. He did not say it aloud. Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway a quarter of an hour later with a tray of tea, which she set on the small side table near the fire with the unhurried efficiency of someone performing a task they have been planning since morning. She looked at Eleanor, and then at Jonathan, and then at the 2 cups on the tray, and the small adjustment at the corners of her mouth was the most satisfied expression Eleanor had seen in that house in 3 years. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," Eleanor said. "Of course, Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Holt said, and left them to it. The days that followed moved with a different quality than the days before them. Lady Cecilia retreated into a species of careful civility that was not warmth and was not hostility, and was, Eleanor thought, the closest her mother was likely to come to acknowledging that she had been wrong without producing any statement to that effect. She did not raise the matter of Mr. Finch again. She did not raise the matter of any further arranged match. She occupied the morning room with her correspondence and her calls, and Eleanor occupied the library with her books and with Jonathan, who continued to come each morning as though nothing had changed, because in the ways that mattered most, nothing had. He told her on a morning in late November, when the first frost had arrived and the garden was stiff with cold, something about his reasons that she had not asked for but was glad to have. He told her that he had come to Wiltshire specifically, that the letters of introduction had been genuine but the timing of them had not been entirely coincidental, that Mrs. Holt had been in service at Ashford Park before her employment at Marsh House, and had written to him once, some 18 months past, about the daughter of the house who spent her mornings in a library that no one else valued, and who had corrected a misprint in a borrowed volume and left a note inside the cover, in case the next reader might wish to know. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Holt's teacup on the tray when he said this, and thought about the note she had left inside the borrowed volume, which had been a plain brown-covered edition of Pliny that a neighbour had lent her father years before, and which she had not thought of since. "Mrs. Holt wrote to you about a note in a borrowed book," she said. "She wrote to me about a great many things," he said. The note was an example. The point of the letter was somewhat larger. Eleanor considered the several years of her life that had passed between that borrowed Pliny and this particular morning, and the several years of her mother's management and her own quiet endurance of it. And she thought that she would have something to say to Mrs. Holt about the efficiency of correspondence when the appropriate moment arrived. The formal proposal came 3 days later in the library in the afternoon, with the particular lack of ceremony that she had come to understand was his natural mode of sincerity. He did not kneel. He sat at the east window desk as he always did, and he asked her, in the same measured and unhurried voice that had discussed Tacitus and Brotia and the reliability of moralistic historians, whether she would consent to becoming Countess of Ashford, and whether she thought the library at Ashford Park might, over time, be considered adequate. Eleanor said that she had not yet seen the Ashford Library, and that she reserved judgment on its adequacy. He said that was a reasonable position. She said yes. On the morning of the last day she spent at Marsh House before the journey to Ashford Park, Eleanor went to the library before anyone else was awake. She lit the fire herself. She stood at her father's desk for a long time, not sitting, just standing with her hands flat on the surface the way she had that first afternoon after Lady Cecilia had announced the Finch betrothal. The room smelled of old paper and cold stone, and the particular warmth of a fire just catching, and it smelled the way it had always smelled, and she let it be what it was. She took the Virgil from the shelf where it had always stood, and she opened it, and she unfolded the paper with her father's neat declension tables in his careful hand, and she looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it again and placed it inside her travelling case, because it was hers, and it belonged with her, and belonging with her was what it had always done. Jonathan was waiting in the entrance hall with Mrs. Holt standing nearby, wearing the expression that was her version of considerable satisfaction. The carriage was on the gravel. The morning air was cold and sharp and full of the smell of frost-stiffened grass, and something that might have been the first wood smoke of the day drifting from the kitchen. He offered her his hand at the carriage step, and when she took it, the grip was steady and unhurried, and precisely what it had always been. She stepped up into the carriage. She did not look back at the house. She looked instead at the road ahead, where the elms on either side of the drive were bare and clean against the November sky. And she thought about a library she had not yet seen, and a shelf of Latin texts she had not yet read, and the several satisfying years of argument and correction and morning fires and autumn light that waited on the other side of the journey, with a man who had once made a deliberate error in a transcription and had been very glad that she had not let it stand.